In the previous panel, we introduced the concept of liability when one creates an obstruction of the lawful use of any common property. Shmot 21 provides us with a case law example of the bor, in which the creator of that bor is liable for any damages that result from a shor or a chamor falling into that pit. It was argued that if we are to read a literal interpretation to the prohibition of lifnei iver lo tetein michshol, then the prohibition in effect is a repeat of Shmot 21, and hence the repetition could be explained in one of two options. One, that it comes to emphasize the severity of creating an obstruction, a bor, or the preferred option, that it comes to address a situation beyond the letter of the law. This Rashi does in his commentary to V'lifnei iver lo tetein michshol, that the iver and the michshol refer to the giving of advice that is inappropriate for that person. In the words of Rashi, lifnei hasuma b'davar, one who is blind, one who is unaware about certain matters, and through the advice the individual will stumble, in other words, be faced with a monetary loss, and worse still, be faced with a threat to one's health and well-being. In this way, the Rebbe responds to the first difficulty that was raised with respect to the commentary of Rashi. Why is it that he takes Vayikra 19:14 out of its literal understanding and reads a situation of potential fraud as the topic of the prohibition? We now come to the second problem, which was that of the example that Rashi produces for this situation of potential fraud, namely al tomer mechor sadacha, one is prohibited from suggesting to an individual to sell one's field, real estate, v'kach lecha chamor, and with the proceeds obtain a chamor, in effect suggesting a change in occupation from farming to the buying, transportation and selling of goods. The question becomes more pronounced when one takes into consideration the source for Rashi's commentary, the Torah Kohanim, in which there are four situations that are read into the V'lifnei iver prohibition. One involving deception and misrepresentation, facilitating the violation of Torah law, and three examples where there is advice that is inappropriate for the individual, advice that leads to a negative impact on one's livelihood, and worse still, upon one's health and safety. Problem 2 was, why is it that Rashi, of the four examples, ignores three of them? One, facilitating the violation of Torah law by, for example, causing a Nazir to consume wine during the 30 days of Nazirut, and the other two examples where the advice given, leaving before daybreak or in the mid-afternoon, which ultimately could lead to a loss of one's savings. Using the argument as to why the Rebbe moves away from a literal reading of the V'lifnei iver as placing a stumbling block in front of a blind man, on the basis that this is a repeat of a prohibition embedded in the case of digging a bore into which an animal might fall, the Rebbe extends this logic to the two examples recorded in the Torah Kohanim. And while one might argue that there is a difference between these two examples and the case law recorded in Sefer Shmot, in that the bor situation involves a physical act of digging a pit, whereas in the two examples there is no physical act but rather a verbal advice, and hence one might argue that one should not be accountable because the verbal advice in of itself did not create that physical obstruction. Nevertheless, from the standpoint of the outcome, the three situations are similar, whether the activity is a physical digging of a bore or the verbal advice which leads to a loss of life and property, in theory could be read into the case law of the bore recorded in Sefer Shmot, and hence reading these two examples into Vayikra 19:14 is unnecessary and repetitive. By the same token, from the standpoint of Torah law, causing one to violate a clearly stated prohibition of the Tariag mitzvot is far more serious than a situation of the bor where there is merely a monetary loss, and where, as noted, we take into consideration the outcome, irrespective of how one came to experience that outcome. Then the example of the Torah Kohanim of providing a Nazir with wine would also be included in the prohibition of creating an obstruction, and hence Vayikra 19:14 would not be required to address that situation. On this basis, The Rebbe argues that Rashi rejected 3 of the 4 examples recorded in the Torah Kahania and is left with example number 4, al tomer mechor sadacha, where the individual gives the advice of selling one's field, v'kach lecha chamor, and with the proceeds purchase a donkey.